One of the things that the organizing committee spends quite a lot of time about is talking about all the different ways that workers are getting squeezed, and there are so many of them. I can list a few in terms of wages, in terms of disappearing benefits if we even had them to begin with, and many workers don't get any benefits at all. All of the consequences of an austerity program by governments around the world in terms of housing costs, in terms of disappearing pensions if there were any to start with, in terms of all the different forms of tax structure and flat fees and who's paying taxes and who's not paying taxes, costs of childcare, costs of seniors care, costs of all the things that aren't included in our public healthcare system and in health management in general, and the destruction, disintegration of any sense of community and society, and the fact that we're all being pitted against each other so that we don't come together to try and fight this beast. So we have 3 union activists that are actively involved in trying to work with other union members and other workers in general to do something out there. We have James Coccola. He first became an activist and an organizer when he was a student leader at UVic. Since then, he's worked on issues of environmental, social, and worker justice. He's currently an executive vice president for the BC Government and Services Employees Union. And I'll let him tell you what he's speaking about. We have Sarah Bjorknas. She's a library worker and a CUPE member. She works in the Burnaby Public Library System, and she's a vice president in her CUPE local and the regional vice president for CUPE BC. She's co-founder of the Vancouver Catholic Worker and has been an organizer with the War Resisters Support Campaign and with Stop War for a long time. And Jason Mann is a longtime union activist, presently working for the United Food and Commercial Workers, Local 1518, and he has a history with many of the unions, and particularly with BCGEU and with the BC Fed. So James is going to go first. Good.
Hi, everyone. I'd like to start off by acknowledging that we're on the traditional territories of the Coast Salish people. So we want to keep that in mind as we go through our talk here today.
Excuse me, you're going to have to speak into that mic.
Right,
All right.
close.
Sorry.
There you go.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Awesome. Just let me know if I start to drift off again. My name is James Coccola. I am an executive vice president for the BCGEU. I first became a union activist when I was working for an environmental nonprofit in Victoria, and we were having some problems with the employer, so we organized. We joined the BCGEU. It was a really tough process, even though our workplace was probably quite predisposed to becoming a union, and our employer wasn't necessarily hostile, but the process was definitely hostile. Shortly after that happened, I left that organization and I became a public employee. I worked for the provincial government in Road Safety BC. Very different than being an activist. Thank you. Very different than being an activist. And I swore that I was never going to get involved again. And so 5 years later, I'm here as an executive vice president. So, yeah. Anyway, so I'm going to talk about how the BCGEU is working to fight back against some of the squeeze that workers are facing. So right away, I want to talk a little bit about the history of BCGEU and how we got to where we are now. So BC Government and Service Employees Union, obviously the large proportion of our members are government employees. And so during the 80s and early 90s, and even in some of the 1990s, one of the big things that we saw with our membership was the provincial government was going through neoliberalization. They were hiving off workers and privatizing them. And so we had a decision to make as a union whether or not we were going to follow our members into the private sector or not. And that's where we started organizing for the first time. We decided that our members, whether or not they were in the private sector or public sector, should be represented by our union. So We started a shift at that point from a purely servicing model union, where we were handling grievances and moving them up the line, to a union that was also working on organizing new workers. So now, today, about 1/3 of our membership is government employees, direct government, and the rest are either privatized services, they are government-funded agencies such as community living, or they're in the private sector. And so, for the past couple of decades, we've been slowly moving the needle from servicing to organizing. So 3 years ago, we took the step to double the size of our organizing department. So now we have 10 full-time staff and a large temporary staff budget dedicated to organizing new workers. So this is the first step of how we're working to push back, and it's the basic thing that we can provide for people, which is a union membership. You may have heard about some of the recent victories that we had. The biggest one and most prominent one was the River Rock Casino. So the River Rock Casino is about 1,200 people, and 960 of them are now BCGU members with a first contract that they just signed a couple months ago. This contract, the average increase was 19% upon the first, just signing the contract was 19% overnight. For one department, it was 53%. The majority of workers at that work site were low paid. The River Rock Casino is the highest grossing casino in the province, and it had the lowest wages. So overnight, we saw that people could go to work and not have to worry about getting to their second job because they didn't need to have a second job anymore. And the thing that I'm most proud of about that contract is on year 4, they're going to be rolled into a pension. So all of a sudden, you get 1,000 people who their wages are going up probably 25%, and they're going to have some retirement security, something that a group of people, many of whom were immigrants, many of whom were very low paid, didn't have before. But the River Rock is just the most prominent example of that. Just last week, we organized 16 members of a Salvation Army certification into the union. So organizing for us is a priority, and it becomes more of a priority as we go forward. But it's really interesting to contrast how much organizing happens in BC versus how much happens in, say, the States. Our budget is about 4% dedicated to organizing. That's high for a lot of unions. In the States, you'll get unions that will put down 50% of their budget into organizing because they're in survival mode. We're not quite there yet in BC, but we're not keeping up to the increasing population. We're losing density, and that's been the case for a very long time. So the BCGU may be prioritizing it, but there's no union in the province that probably prioritizes enough to increase density across the board, and it's something that is a challenge for this movement, and it will continue to be a challenge of this movement for quite a long time until we put the resources into it.
How about the marijuana stores?
There was, I think in California, one of them was unionized, but we have a campaign on that actually. The other thing we've pushed towards is internal organizing. So historically, the RAND formula came in, or PC 1002, privy count? No? Okay. Dues checkoff. So we didn't have to go around anymore and collect union dues. This was great for our organization in terms of we didn't have to go around and harass people for their weekly dues, but it disconnected the membership from the union, and it made it much harder for us to activate our membership. And so we've been working really hard on internal campaigns through digital technology, but also through giving our activists training on how to engage their membership so that we can try to build back some of those relationships that unions traditionally had. And it really showed in, do you ever remember the anti-fascist rally in Vancouver that had thousands of people show up to it? So for that event, we actually managed to activate hundreds of our members to come out to that event. And we held a separate event right next to it, and then we marched and joined them. We had hundreds of us be able to mobilize people on a non-work related issue. I mean, I argue it probably is work related, but we won't get into that theory. It was huge for us, and it's huge for the labor movement as a whole to be able to say, well, we're actually going to bring out hundreds of people to this event, and we're going to show the power of the union movement on a social cause, not just in dollars, but in people. But I really want to talk about one of our next big things that we're working on, and it's called Affordable BC. So what is the biggest challenge to workers see today? Do we have any thoughts?
A roof.
Sorry? A roof.
Housing.
Housing, yeah. Housing is ridiculous. And there's absolutely no way that any union could keep up with a 30% increase in housing costs in 1 year, which is what happened in Vancouver. Right? The NDP in the last election promised a $400 rebate for renters. Rent next year is going up by 4%. So that $400, if they give it in February, is going straight to your landlord. There isn't a way for us to negotiate with the employers a way to fix that. We need to go and try to deal with the systemic issue, which is inflated housing costs. So we have a campaign called Affordable BC. You find it at affordablebc.ca. We're asking people to sign on, and we're going to try to build support broadly outside the labor movement and inside the labor movement for changes to a number of things. As I look at my notes, we want to look for reform to the property tax to make sure that we're taxing speculators correctly. Because right now what's happening is we have people coming in, buying up land, sitting on it while the city builds transit right next to it. All of a sudden the property goes up 20%, they flip that property, everybody pays more. We should be capturing the value, the increased value from that property and putting it towards public services. And we should be putting it towards affordable housing. We should be amending legislation to protect the renters. We should be making sure that when rents are increased, it's tied to the unit, not necessarily the person. We have seen some success with the government saying they're going to end the fixed term lease issue, but that's just a small thing, and it's not going to actually fix the problem. And we need to see a massive increase in investment in affordable housing for working people across the province, because this is most acute in Vancouver, but I'm from Victoria, and it happens in Victoria, it happens in Kamloops, it happens in Kelowna, it happens in Nanaimo.
In Hope.
It happens in Hope.
Hope and beyond.
Right? So unions and broader civil society need to tackle this issue strongly, and they need to stand up and say that we need to make sure that housing is more than just, the housing is for housing, and housing isn't an investment for people who don't live here. Even people who do live here need to understand that people need a roof over their heads. So that's some of the things that the BCGU is doing to push back and help out workers, and I'm looking forward to hearing some questions afterwards. Thank you.
Okay. So thanks for reminding me, James, to say a little bit about why, how I came to the union movement, because I think it's relevant. And I definitely had some difficulty. The more time I decided to spend on thinking about what I was going to say today, the more difficulty I had, because it's such a big issue. We could talk about almost anything. So I've taken a little bit of maybe a bit of a historical big picture perspective on it. But I became a CUPE member when I became employed by the Burnaby Public Library, and didn't realize at the time that it was a union job. But I came from a family where my dad was an operating engineer and a solid union member, not an activist. So I understood that if you belong to a union, you go to union meetings. And if you go to all the union meetings, you end up here. So here I am. And CUPE being the largest union in Canada, but uniquely structured compared to a lot of other unions, it will be hard for me to speak about, what is CUPE doing, but I'm glad that James talked about organizing, and props to the BCGU. You're doing some pretty cool organizing these days, and I'm happy to say that it feels like CUPE is picking up the pace and recognizing the value and the need, but we're far behind, and we're all far behind for sure. So on the question of that was posed, how has the workers' movement and the politicians they support fought back, or has it? And I would say, yes, we've fought back, but in the origins of our workers' movement, let's say just here in colonial Canada, what may have started out as philosophical battles for people, and around political philosophy and the way the world should be organized, quickly became survival battles, and with narrow focus on how do we earn enough to support ourselves, support our families, to survive. And as unionists, we've achieved some political and legislative success. We had to in order to become the movement that we are. And I think that has led, in a lot of cases, to some perhaps false sense of accomplishment. We get to a certain place and we think, okay, we're good. We've achieved some of these gains. We've got to a place where we can do the work of representing members in the workplace. But that, of course, I think has led to reduced militancy and vision in our movement. There will always be folks, probably like us and some others, who feel that way, but it is still that uphill battle, that survival mode kind of thinking that bogs us down. I've been doing some reading recently, and very inspired by Jane McAlevey, talking about organizing and the way that we connect with members. And for me, that connects very strongly with how I feel about the community in general, not just from my perspective as a worker and a union member. And I think that is one of the strengths of the labor movement, is when we remember to say it and to act on it, is that we are the community. Workers represent all facets of our communities, and when we remember that and make the effort to do the work that supports all aspects of our lives, we are more effective. But it's hard to do when you've got your head down at work and there's things going on and you're dealing with those issues. So organizing is inspiring because it's about real relationship building. It's hard work, takes a lot of, as we said, money and effort. It takes people power, building relationships. And something that I'm going to talk a little bit about is the movement. And it's actually been going on for a long time, but it's now being sort of given some focus on precarious work. Precarious and transient work is a big thing inside and outside of the union movement. So we're chasing wages and security, and that's our focus in the workplace. But we also, for folks who have not had the opportunity to work in a unionized environment, we do that practical work of protecting our rights under our contracts and our rights under legislation. But we also do emotional and personal support work. We deal with issues like harassment and issues under the Human Rights Code that we'd like to think are no-brainers, that these things don't happen in our work and in our society, but they do. And who's on the floor to see and to act, but the union activists. And because we do that kind of work, you would think that it really should be a big open door, that people would welcome us with open arms, because they recognize that the power of having someone on your side and someone who will pay attention and someone who will take a risk to stand up for your rights in whatever way that is, whether it's you're not being paid the appropriate rate, or whether you're suffering from harassment from a boss or from a coworker. What I think is missing in our movement, so that we have these struggles and we talk about being squeezed, is there's a lack of analysis. And again, I think it's because culturally we are all in this survival mode, look after ourselves, look after our families, don't have time to think about that big picture. And when we do, like as I was preparing for this today, it becomes rather overwhelming when you think about all the aspects of our lives that we could act on and wish we could. So analysis of the workplace, analysis of our employers, who they are, why they are. For me, I work in a municipality, and so it's lower level government. James was talking about 1/3 of BCGU representing provincial government employees. There's all these levels of government, and so that's where political action comes in for us, because we talk about electing our employers. But we also do that because we are the community, and we as public sector workers want to defend those services that we have. And who's better placed to do that than people who understand what's going on with them and how they work. We don't talk about economy or class structure or social structure or political structure at all those levels. Those are all levels of things that I think we have this organizing base, but there's so much else going on that there's lots of opportunity, but a difficulty to land on particular things. How am I doing for time?
Still got
Okay, all right. Let's talk about politics. So I had to remind myself a little bit about our, in Canada, our political history with Labour and the NDP. I recently was asked to take on the role of chairing a political action committee for QBBC the previous 2 years. So I had to sort of readjust my political focus, because I identify as an anarchist, but I come from an NDP family. One of the things that we did, because we really wanted QP members in BC particularly, to be active in politics, and preferably with the NDP, because we see that that's where our interests will be best represented. But to do that, we knew that we actually had to talk to workers about why should they support the NDP, not just because we think that they represent our interests, but because we have a history with them. And so we were all reminded about how the NDP was formed nationally, the joining of the CCF and the CLC. And I think that made a difference for people to remember that it's an active part of our history, it's an active part of the struggle, that people have recognized that workers and farmers came together against a changing economy to continue to try to build their political power, so that some of these struggles and some of this squeeze could be alleviated. Still doesn't answer the question of the bigger political picture about, is this really the kind of social and political structure we want? But we're trying to work within it and hopefully expand it. So, the NDP is not a Labour Party like in many places in Europe. It doesn't have that kind of history. The CCF was formed because they didn't want Labour to have too strong a role, but in the end found that that's, again, that natural organizing base. We're all workers, and places where workers are already connected is a really good place to start. So I want to talk about precarity and precarious work, because that's something that's come up for QP. And I've seen it in my in my union, in my local, for a long time, it's very common in library work that 75% of the members who are library workers in QB23 are not full-time. Now, in some ways that makes some sense because of the kind of hours of public service that we provide and in the past, the type of work that we do, because we don't want necessarily full-time work that will cause injury. But it's something that has happened on a grander scale now and finally being noticed. And I'll use Burnaby again as an example. We have Parks and Rec workers who now make up almost, well, I would say that more than half, probably more than half of our membership. And there are 1,300 auxiliary workers. And I would say, I think 400 of those are aquatics workers.
Which means casual.
Yeah, so good point. Definitions are important. Auxiliary, on-call, casual, contract, temporary, those are all words to help to describe precarious work. And so folks might not believe that in a unionized environment we have something that was, that we would call precarious work or that we would have these high percentages, but we do, and it's because we've allowed it to happen. And I'm not sure what the answer is, but I know that I probably didn't have the language to articulate it at the time, but I've watched it happen where in our local, because we have municipal workers, outside workers, inside workers, library workers, and you have some of those really historic full-time with benefits jobs who have access to overtime and all of that kind of stuff, who have been that anchor and that they were literally the parent body of the local. And that is the model that everyone relies on for work. And when we can't achieve it, it's like we just didn't pay any attention at all. And so all of these contract employees who are not permanent employees until they become at least permanent part-time, it's been allowed to grow, and they're abused. In terms of, seniority means nothing. Scheduling is, the favoritism is obscene. So this issue of precarious work has really started to explode because across the country, QP represents workers in places like libraries, parks and rec, healthcare support, custodial work in public institutions. These are the places where precarious work is racialized, gendered, and young often. And so late to the game, this is a struggle that is inspiring people to work on, but is also challenging people to figure out what are we going to do, what does it mean to be a precarious worker under these collective agreements that we have that have all of these rights and benefits for folks who are full-time and is segregated for those who are not. So one example currently is that we've got we've got an arbitration coming up around auxiliary access to work because they can't prove on what basis they were or weren't giving it to someone, and we're using a technicality around layoff and recall language to end. We think we have a shot at it. So it's difficult because the work was never done before, and now we have to play catch up. But we're trying to find places where we can dig in and try to make some change. So the answer is yes, we fought back, but not good enough, and it's probably not going to end anytime soon.
Great. My name is Jason Mann. I'm from the United Food and Commercial Workers, Local 1518. And I just wanted to thank you for giving me the opportunity to explain some of the ways that in the retail sector workers are being squeezed. So my first introduction to UFCW Local 1518 was on a picket line at a grocery store in Prince George. I'd actually worked down the street at a different store, but at the store where there was a picket line, one of the largest retailers in Canada was asking people to take a wage rollback where their top rate was $25 an hour, and they wanted a new contract where the top rate was $12 an hour. And I stood on that picket line in Prince George, and from that I started thinking, it was a pretty proud moment to be involved in the union, and that's sort of some of the things that inspire me. So I think when it comes to retail, it's important to address some myths. And there's a lot of myths. So maybe I'll start with some facts. So first off, retail work, it's important work, it's good work, it's work that needs to be done. It's actually a pretty sizable chunk of our economy. Retail is the largest employment sector in BC, somewhere around 280,000 people work in retail. There's sort of a myth that, retail work, it's not very productive, maybe there shouldn't be high wages, but the reality is that there's lots and lots of money in retail. We're always hearing from employers about, there's a lot of competition and things are really tight and we just don't have any money. I don't know if that's true or not. Here's what I do know, is that if you look at some of the richest families across North America, lots of them made their money in the retail sector. Like if you think of the Waltons, if you think of like Jeff Bezos, if you think about in Canada, if you think of the West Fair or the Westons, Jimmy Pattison in BC, if you think of the Sobeys family, the Cat family, the Bouchard family, they all made their money in retail. So if there's not much money in it, I don't know where they got all their money from. I think there's lots of money, and I think that's probably why they keep opening retail stores, keep opening grocery stores, is that this is actually an area that is important and that also generates a lot. Talking about that squeeze, it's also important to know our background is mostly in the retail food industry. It's important to look at that these are very highly monopolized industries. So somebody brought up Pattison. A lot of the grocery stores that you see, you may not realize that they're all owned by the exact same people. So in BC, Pattison owns Save On Foods, he owns Urban Fare, he owns Bilo, he owns Price Smart, he owns Nestor's, he owns Meinhardt, he owns Quality Foods. The Sobeys family owns Safeway, they own Thrifty Foods. Not only is it highly monopolized in just the actual retailing, but they actually have monopolies up and down the chain. So they sell, who do they buy the groceries from? They buy them from themselves. Who does the transportation? They own the transportation companies, so they bill it to themselves, they sell it to themselves, and they tell the workers, look, this grocery store, it's not making any money. Our rents are too high. And then we look into, well, who's the landlord? We find out, well, you're the landlord. You're charging yourself rent, and then you're saying you're not making any money. So there's lots and lots of money. The challenge is that not enough of it is going to the workers. So just to recap on that, retail, it's the largest employment sector, it's highly monopolized, lots of money, just the workers aren't getting it. And I think one of the things that gives me hope is that if we look at the 70s and the 80s, and if we look at and thinking specifically about the grocery sector, start rates in the grocery sector adjusted to inflation, if you started at a grocery store, you'd be probably making about $20 to $25 an hour. That was the start rate. I know my mother, she was a member for years. She worked at SuperValu. When she eventually went to university and became a teacher, she took a pay cut from working at SuperValu to go become a teacher. It's something she wanted to do, but my point is that even at those start rates, they were making good money. So thinking about how workers are being squeezed, one of the big things that we're focused on right now is a lot of the sort of emerging technological changes that are happening in retail, and folks are probably familiar with. Amazon Go is the big one that people are talking about. I think it's important to remember as we prepare for some of these changes that big technological changes are nothing new to the retail industry. The two sort of technological changes are that have come out over and over again are issues around automation, computerization, and I said two, and then I'm going to give three, and pushing work to the customers. So what I mean by that is, so self-checkouts is a good example, but we can go even further than that. We can look at the 1920s when Safeway was one of the first companies to introduce, they called it the Safeway self-serve plan. Essentially, you could go get the groceries yourself. You didn't have to ask a clerk to go get it. So we saw that in the 20s. In the 50s, we saw the emergence of 50s and 60s, we saw the advent of huge supermarkets, which changed the industry. We saw other changes with barcode scanners and increasingly sophisticated point-of-sale systems, and most recently we've seen self-serve checkouts. My point being is that, what used to be retail workers, not only are they a highly monopolized industry, but they're actually more productive than they've ever been. The amount of groceries that used to be sold by 10 people can be sold, by, I think something like 3 or 5. I should have picked, I like ratios that are smaller than that. Maybe, let's say 5 to 1 is closer when you compare. And we've always had some of the solutions back then are actually some of the solutions we should look at today. The way that we adjusted to the advent of supermarkets. In retail, many folks don't know that we actually have a 36-hour work week for 40 hours for pay for a large number of our workers. We call it ATO. And essentially, the thought was that if there's going to be these changes, rather than having all of the benefits just go to the companies and having layoffs for us, why don't we reduce the work week, not have any loss in pay, and reduce some of the layoffs? And the technical way that works in the retail sector is every week that you work, you get 4 hours off with pay. So essentially, you get a day off every 2 weeks, and that's been our structure, or that's been the how things have gone. So when we look at some of the big technological changes coming, it looks like they're pretty substantial. I've seen some reports suggesting 90 to 95% of retail work can be automated, which is significant, thinking that it's the largest employment sector in BC. If you look at the transportation sector, that's pretty, just thinking about all of the ways that groceries get to your shelf. The automation of the transportation from the warehouse is easy to understand. They've already fully automated the warehouse. So the only actual work, and Sobeys has this giant warehouse, the only work that's actually needed in the warehouse is they need somebody to pull the pallet off the truck and just place it in the warehouse. Everything else is automated. A little sort of computerized thing comes by, it picks it up, it sorts it, it puts it away on the right shelf. When an order comes in from the store, another robot comes by, takes it off the shelf, assembles a pallet, and another worker has to put it back on, put it on the truck. Looking at grocery stores, I think the only fortunate thing for us with self-checkouts is right now they don't really work well and people hate using them, but that technology is advancing. I think that's where Amazon Go is substantial.
Some of us refuse to use them.
Some refuse to. Yeah, that's good, and thank you for doing that. But we're seeing sort of the advent of sort of the next wave of computerization and automation in retail of robots that can stock shelves in the same way that robots can do price scans, price changes. So a lot of this is coming, and sort of what this means is that we essentially have two paths. We can have one path where we have job losses and where all of those benefits can go to all of those monopolies, the Pattersons, the Westons, the Sobeys in the world, or we can do what we've done in the past, which is reduce the work week with no loss in pay in our collective agreements. That's called ATO. We should probably look at expanding that and ensuring that retail jobs are good jobs again. So thanks for giving me the opportunity to speak about some of the conditions facing retail workers.
Okay, we've got some time. We've got about 15 minutes. And so if you've got questions, discussion points, let me get the mic.
Thanks very much for your talks. I think my understanding, so I'm not Canadian obviously from my accent, but I'm curious, so you're talking about work unions and I see the squeeze on people what about people who are not in unions? And you talked about some of the issues in terms of austerity. In England we have 0-hour contracts, and people have got mortgages to pay, kids to pay for. There's so many issues, and then you see some perhaps younger people, and not everyone, they are work on social media all the time, not necessarily, but people are distracted perhaps in, I don't know, say 50 years ago, perhaps not, but there seems to be so many issues, and if you're not in a union, even if you are in a union, it seems very tough. I mean, if you're not in a union, how I don't see a path forward. I'm trying to be optimistic, maybe because I'm British or not. You know, how is there a path forward? It just seems that with megacorp, and not just in this country, but all over the world, it seems to be taking over. You know, just if you have any thoughts on that, I'd appreciate that. Thank you.
Lots of thoughts. Well, something that I didn't say, but I was thinking about was, you know, we do need to celebrate the fact that despite what I may think are limited achievements of the labor movement, we have made those achievements and established some standards and established some bottom lines that have benefited all workers. So not just unionized workers, right? So I think holding on to that history and trying to keep and increase some of the power that we have to shift, you know, how society works. It does benefit everyone. I mean, it may seem to us and it may seem to other people that when we're working on, you know, bargaining our collective agreement, and we may have to go on strike to achieve what we think is a justified wage increase, that may seem very self-centered, but it contributes to the whole of society in terms of what, you know, what standards and what value is there on work, and how we should, and from the public service perspective, you know, that we need to, for all members of society, have those services, whether they are recreation services, cultural services, education services, health services. So, you know, making sure that we stand strong in those places helps keep that sort of keep raising that platform for everyone. I used to say that I didn't think that it was necessary that everyone have a union. You know, there are some employers out there that behave in those ways. I don't think I would say that anymore. I think that there's so many things that are valuable, and the things that I spend my time on are a lot about human relations in the workplace, which are important because now we're talking about physical and mental health, and that comes with you when you leave the workplace too. So yeah, there's lots to think about.
Anybody else?
So one thing that a lot of the unions in BC have been doing, they've been supporting a number of things you've probably seen. So the BC Federation of Labour and a number of unions were some of the big players behind the Fight for 15 campaign, which successfully got the minimum wage on the ballot box, essentially. And while we don't have an exact timeline and when we're getting to $15 minimum wage, it's coming. And that's something that's going to affect workers across the province. And that's, you know, unions have a big role to play in helping support civil society groups. So we, at the BCGU, we partner with dozens of groups across the province. But one I really like to highlight is the Together Against Poverty Society in Victoria, who do work for people who aren't unionized. They've essentially filed grievances to the government for people who don't have a union, and that a lot of that work wouldn't be possible without the support of unions, financial support, essentially. So there are a number of things. So yeah, there are lots of organizations like that who do great work that need the support of unions financially.
And I would say one of the most important things we can do for workers who don't have a union yet is to actually hold the standards that we have high, keep fighting for them, and keep fighting to raise them. In retail, our sort of example was between Safeway, which was a unionized company, and Thrifty Foods, which was a non-union company. And every time we would get a wage increase at Safeway that we would negotiate, a few weeks later, Thrifty Foods would roll it out to their non-union employers, or non-union workers, which is, I think, why it's so important that and that's also one of the reasons why it doesn't work to continue to lower our standards, because as we lower our standards, because we set the standards, they'll just be undercut further. I missed the actual most important point of that story about the picket line in Prince George, where we stood up against an employer who wanted to reduce the wage from $26 to $12, which was that store closed. That rather than pay people $26 an hour, the employer, West Fair Foods, decided to close the store. And that was still really important. One of the things why I'm still proud about that is that if we would have agreed to reduce the standards, it would have been more than just that tiny extra foods in Prince George. That would have had larger implications, which is why it's so important just to hold our standards as high as we can.
Something else that's quite exciting an initiative, we talked about it in an earlier workshop, is worker action centers. And I believe UFCW is one of the unions that supports it, and this is more in Ontario and back east, where they're providing services for workers that don't have a union, similar to what you're talking about in Victoria, but on a larger scale. Translation services, legal services, training, and all kinds of things. And that's an initiative that unions are starting to look at with a view to empowering people and training them so that, you know, they might possibly help organize within their sectors once they kind of get settled in on the ground. So that's another initiative. Yep.
I want to read something to you, and then I've got a comment that I would like to raise. It says, there's one organized force with all its flaws has traditionally been in the forefront of efforts to improve the lives of the general population. That's organized labor. It's the one barrier to the vicious cycle going on which leads to corporate tyranny. A major reason for the concentrated, almost fanatic attack on unions and organized labor is that they are a democratizing force. That's a comment made by Noam Chomsky. And one of the things that I see a weakness in the trade union movement, and it was there when I was there, so I was as responsible for lack of education as the president of the Carpenters as anyone today. And Ed Finn and people that have been in the educational forefront with the CLC and trade unions across the country have said that one of the biggest weaknesses of the trade union movement is education, not just of their members, but the population in general. My brother here was a member of the TWU, and when the TWU got into a big strike a number of years ago, and they took it to the Fed, and the trade union movement got together, and what happened? There was a general strike raised, and we did it on the basis of regions, the north and the south, the east, the west. Nanaimo was the first one to go out. And once that the corporations in this bloody province understood that the trade union movement were on the war path, and they said, we've had enough. You know, what was said by the president of the Fed at that time was, the gloves are off. That was Jim Kinnaird. And until we get back to that, I'm saying until we get back to that, and I don't envy you the problems that you have today, because they were bad enough then. They're far worse today. The employers have got a hell of a lot stronger upper hand than what they had then. So I don't raise these things in criticism, but I raise it as something that if you're going to hold the neoliberal agenda is out to do away with the trade union movement. Make no bloody mistake about it. They want to get rid of you. They're not interested in two-tier wages. That's okay for now. Jimmy will be satisfied that for now, but next year it'll be more, and something else a year after. And as robotization comes in and more automation, you're going to find it's going to be a hell of a lot harder. And the only way you can win that is what I'm trying to say, is if you bring old turkeys like me to the fore. And we need to be going to our councils in our municipalities. The labor movement needs to get off its ass at the labor council level and start developing a rapport with the community and what's going on in these lousy jobs, part-time jobs that people can't live under. Because I'm going to suggest to you And I've been before the council in New Westminster and raised these issues, and it stopped the selling off of some jobs and privatizing them to the electrical department and so forth. If you get the people in the community with you and you raise the ante, you're gonna be a hell of a lot more successful, because otherwise, it's gonna be year after year. And the question of education is so bloody important, not just with your membership, as I try to point out, but also the community in general. There's more people out there. There's over 800,000 seniors in this province. That's more than there are in the trade union movement. And I'm going to suggest to you that there's more retired trade unionists in this province than there are active members today, just because that's the way the world is. And you want to draw on those people. You want to draw on us. And I just say that. I hope you take it back, that there has to be more education, because where we're going now with the neo-liberal agenda is further down the drain, and the general population understands that. And the general population will support the trade union movement.
Well, we saw that in the teachers' strike, that we had a huge amount of popular support, but we still, I mean, it's an interesting situation because we were able to at least hold our own. And ours was an interesting battle because, yeah, we were asking for wage increases, which we never get, but we were more importantly asking for our working conditions and living conditions. And so it's really hard because we had a huge amount of public support behind what we were doing, but we still, I mean, we were out for 5 weeks, 6 weeks, it was a long time. And when we went back, I mean, we won in the court, but I have to say that even though we won, after almost 15 years of battling it out in the court, this has probably been the worst startup ever. And that the conditions within the schools, and it's interesting in terms of just that, I'm thinking about the automation, you know, there's all these new systems that they're putting in, which are increasing the amount of administrative office work that I do and taking away from the teaching time. So it's true, we do have to fight together, but there's been a ton of times when we all were mobilized and then the leadership said, no, we can't go out. We can't possibly do that. So I think you're right, it has to become fairly militant, but the leadership hasn't been that militant. Not just in my union, but I remember in the early 2000s where it was the health workers, and we were all mobilized. Like, we knew where we were supposed to go on that May 1st, but it was called off. And I'm still pretty bitter about that because I think that was the beginning of our you know, not being able to fight back as strong as we could.
Yep. I would just, those are the things that we need to think about. Something that I was going to mention, I forgot, but I'm reminded by James talking about the Together Against Poverty Society. So we need allies, and we need, and whether those are retired union members or members of the public who don't have a direct connection to the movement, but use all the services that we provide as workers, whether they're public services or retail services or manufacturing services, all of those things. And so thinking about how we operate not just in our unions, but in the community, in politics, but also in community organizations. And so one of those that I think has a great model with great potential here in the Lower Mainland is the Metro Vancouver Alliance, because it's something that operates on a level that helps us to get over some of those overwhelming issues of we could work on everything together. A, how do we come to consensus on what our position is, and B, what do we work on? What do we think is the thing that's going to do it for us? And the model there is that we have this coalition of groups, labor, faith, and community groups, but we only work on things that we all can agree on, and we can, and so we can focus that energy on issues that everyone can agree to take this position on. So rather than trying to solve all of the issues, we come together and work on an issue, and we come together and get to know each other, and then and those ally relationships build and grow. And I think that that's really important, and that's why organizing is so important. And it's something that we don't do enough of, whether we're organizing ourselves or we're working in the community.
So there's been some interesting comments from both the last two speakers. Maybe I'll say that there are so many barriers to building workers' power, and a lot of those are imposed upon us. So whether it's the Labor Relations Board, there was one bad decision at the Labor Relations Board in the mid-2000s, and now half of the workers who work at the BC liquor stores are auxiliary workers, and we can't convert them over to regular positions. There's structures in place that were put in by people who don't believe in unions and want them to fail. And sometimes the barriers are ourselves. Sometimes they are leadership. They don't want to take a bold step on something. That's definitely common. I wish I could say it wasn't always true, but and I definitely agree with. So I didn't catch the first speaker who's standing over here. Bill. The union should be doing more on education. Our resources are spread in 1,000 different ways, but particularly for our own members, we should be investing time and money in making sure that members have education and they're getting political education, because nobody else is giving it to them. Their employer is going to give them to them, but we don't want them to necessarily hear that message. We would like to hear a message about building workers' power and why they're in a union and why it's important, and how we can grow the movement.